One of the core security components for networking in Azure are NSGs, also known as network security groups. And what are they? They're essentially a traffic filter, a network filter that's checking traffic. Think of it like a firewall, and it basically allows or restricts traffic to resources in our Azure network. There are two types of rules. There are inbound rules and outbound rules that you'll see in the upcoming flow that we'll walk through. And finally, they can be associated to a subnet or a network interface card, and it's very important, something I'll reinforce over and over throughout the section. Finally, it is worth noting that in classic Azure, you were able to associate NSGs with the virtual machine itself, but that changed under the ARM model, and now you've got the network interface card and the subnet that you can associate with ONI. Now, if we look at this from a flow perspective, if we've got some virtual machines in subnet B that wish to communicate with virtual machines in subnet A, we ultimately go through this kind of traffic flow. The virtual machine in subnet B wants to communicate with this virtual machine in subnet A, and the traffic goes out through the subnet NSG in this example. And that NSG is going to check it from an outbound rules perspective. If it's all okay there, then the traffic will continue on to subnet A. The NSG in subnet A will check it from an inbound rules perspective, and then if everything's okay, allow it to talk to the virtual machine in subnet A. Now again, this can be applied at the network interface or subnet level, and the subnet rules apply to all the resources in the subnet. Now think about this from a rule precedence perspective. If the NSG is applied to the network interface card and the traffic is coming outbound, it may never even reach the subnet NSG. That network interface card overrules the subnet policy. The same in reverse. If we're coming into the subnet, and let's say that the NSG associated with the subnet allows the traffic in, it'll get to the virtual machine, and then the network interface card can still deny it. So just think of it from that perspective. It gets denied, outbound first from the network interface card, then to the NSG on the subnet. If it's reversing coming inbound, the traffic is stopped potentially first at the subnet NSG and then again at the network interface card NSG. Now, what are some of the properties that you configure when you create a network security group? Well, aside from just giving it a name, we have to define these things. One is the protocol that we want to allow. For example, could be TCP or UDP. Second, the source and destination port range. So anything in the range from 1 to 65,535, or we could simply choose a star for all ports. We have our source and destination address prefixes. So this could be our ranges, or we could use default tags, which I'll come on to shortly. We can do our direction, so inbound or outbound. That's obviously a natural property there, and that, as we went through the flow previously, that's going to determine where things are going to be stopped. The priority, which I'll also come on to in a moment, so that's, in what order are these rules evaluated, and then whether we choose to allow access or deny access based on the rule we've just defined. So we set the criteria, and then at the end we say allow or deny. So what about rule priority that I mentioned? Well, rules are enforced based on priority. As you can see there, they have a range from 100 to 4,096, and the lower numbers have the highest priority. So if you've got a rule that's 100, that's going to be a higher priority than a rule that's, lower down the spectrum, closer to the 4,096. So hopefully that gives you an idea there. Now, the default tags I mentioned are also really important because they can make things a little bit simpler when we're trying to restrict certain ranges of IP address. And these are system provided to identify groups of IP addresses that Azure has provided for you. And there are three major ones that you need to deal with. First of all is your virtual network. So this includes all the CIDR ranges defined in Azure for virtual networks. In addition, you've got your Azure Load Balancer. This is Microsoft Azure's infrastructure load balancer, i.e. this is an Azure data center IP address. And finally, we have internet. So this is all Azure space outside and reachable by the public internet. And this includes all of the Azure-owned public IP space. Now, if you're still unsure what these are for, just remember when we create our rules, we can choose to use service tags instead. So rather than us having to try and figure out all these IPs that we want to deny in these services where there's groups and groups of IPs, we can simply use the default tag instead. And this just makes it a lot easier for us to say, okay, I don't want to allow any traffic to Azure Load Balancer, well, I can use a default tag for that. Now, when we look at the NSGs and we've created one, there are a number of default rules that are created as well. And we've got the inbound and outbound rules on screen for you. And they essentially are the same if you look at the categories across them. So if we look at the top row in both inbound and outbound, which is called allow VNet inbound and allow VNet outbound, this is for traffic originating and ending in a virtual network. And this is allowed for both inbound and outbound directions, as you can see there. Then you have internet on the bottom there. This is allowed by default out, but is blocked coming in. And finally, in the middle row there, we have our Azure load balancer. And this allows the load balancer to probe the health of your VMs and role instances. Now, you can change these rules, but you can't delete them. They have to be there in the network security group. By default, what you will notice is that the priorities are very, very low. So they're not set to a high priority. A lot of the rules you create will be given a higher precedence over these ones. One final thing we just need to cover on networking is around networking limits. And you can see the limits on screen. You can get the latest limits by checking on the Azure website. Now there's a couple I'll just bring your attention to. For one, there is a default limit for network security groups of 100, but this can be increased very easily to 400. NSG rules per an NSG, we're looking at a default of 200, but this can be increased to 500. But the other ones I'll bring your attention to are public IP addresses, which for dynamic ones you can have 60, for reserved public IP addresses 20, and to actually get those increased, you have to contact support, and they don't like to increase those very easily. So that's just something to be aware of there as you're thinking through some of your network configurations.